My wife is obsessed with sex. I can't take it anymore. According to the American Association of Marriage and Family Therapists, over 50% of marriages end due to sexual problems. In most cases, it's a lack of intimacy. But what if the problem isn't a lack, but an excess? Here's my story. Emily and I have been together for 7 years, and from the first day we met, there was always a spark between us. We met in September 2017 at a small cafe on the outskirts of New York City, where I worked at the time. Her eyes, her laughter, her energy, all of it captivated me. We've always had a strong attraction to each other, and our intimate life was never an issue. In fact, it was a source of joy and unity. But about 6 months ago, something changed. It was around February 2024 when I first started noticing that Emily was becoming obsessed with intimacy. At first, I didn't think much of it. We had always been active in that sense, so the first few weeks were even enjoyable. But over time, it started to drain me. Emily began demanding intimacy almost every day, sometimes multiple times a day. I'd come home from work, exhausted after a 10-hour shift at the construction company, and she'd already be waiting for me with those eyes. Eyes that left no room for fatigue or refusal. The first serious wake-up call for me came in March, when I noticed my work performance was sharply declining. Mr. Gray, my boss, mentioned a few times that I looked tired and distracted, but how could I explain to him that it wasn't work that was draining me, but what was happening at home? I kept quiet, bottling it all up, hoping that it was just a phase and that it would pass. But it didn't pass. Emily continued to insist on intimacy at all hours of the day and night. It reached absurd levels. Sometimes she'd wake me up in the middle of the night, demanding attention. I started to feel less like a husband and more like an instrument for satisfying her needs. The intimacy no longer brought me joy. Every new day brought a fresh wave of anxiety. I could feel my emotional state deteriorating. I began avoiding her, sometimes staying late at the office or making up plans with friends, when in reality, I'd just sit in my car trying to relax. I'm breaking down. I no longer know what to do. I can't just talk to her because she genuinely believes this is normal. But for me, it's no longer a game. It has become a heavy burden. I'm exhausted, drained, and unsure how much longer I can take it. Reddit, users' comments, you/realist. 2020, dude, this sounds like genuine exhaustion. Honestly, it sounds like a form of addiction, and you both need to talk to a professional before this destroys your marriage. You/lost hope. 88. I was in a similar situation. My ex-girlfriend also made excessive demands, and I just couldn't meet her needs. It led to major self-esteem issues. You're not alone. You empathic turtle. It sounds like Emily is going through some internal crisis, and she doesn't know how to cope with it. She might be using intimacy as a way to avoid dealing with other emotional problems. You both need help. You Thessaliantuan. This is seriously affecting your mental health. You need to find a way to talk to her about your feelings and explain that you need space. I hope you find a way to resolve this. Reddit post title, My Wife is Obsessed with Sex. I Can't Take It Anymore, Part 2. For those who missed the first part, my wife Emily has become obsessed with sex. At first it seemed fun, but after several months, I feel broken. Here's what my daily life looks like now. It all started around April 2024. I came home from work late in the evening, around 8:30 p.m., completely exhausted. That day had been extremely hard. We were working on pouring the foundation at the construction site, and I had been working almost nonstop. It had been over 12 hours without a break. I could barely stand and was dreaming only of having dinner, taking a shower, and crashing into bed. But when I opened the door to our Brooklyn apartment, instead of peace, I was met by Emily in new lingerie, holding a glass of wine, with intentions that were very clear. She had already set everything up, candles, music, just like in the movies. The problem was, I was on the verge of physical exhaustion. I politely asked her to give me some time so I could take a shower and at least catch my breath. but she got offended. She literally said, "Why are you always so cold lately?" But it wasn't coldness. I was simply exhausted. The next day, the situation repeated itself. I came home earlier, around 6 p.m., thinking I could finally get some rest. We had even made plans to meet friends at a bar to unwind a little. But half an hour before we were supposed to leave, Emily approached me again, with those same eyes. She was already prepared. I explained that we had plans and needed to hurry, but she didn't want to listen. We ended up being late, and the whole evening she looked irritated, even in the presence of our friends. I saw her exchanging looks with Tony, and it made me feel even worse. This is what our life looks like now. Her desires arise at the most inconvenient moments. And it's not just about physical exhaustion. My emotions are at their limit too. We've stopped talking about anything else. All our conversations revolve around her desires or my reluctance. She doesn't understand that for me, it's no longer something pleasant. It's become a duty. Last week, I decided to have a serious conversation with her. It was after another hard day when I came home around 7 p.m. and found her, once again, waiting. I sat down and said we needed to talk. I explained that I was feeling exhausted, both physically and emotionally. I honestly admitted that it's becoming hard for me to see our relationship revolving only around intimacy. Emily's response stunned me. She looked at me with surprised eyes and said, "Are you serious? This is completely normal for a married couple. Everyone lives like this." At that moment, I realized she doesn't see any problem at all. To her, this is just a normal part of a relationship. But for me, it's not anymore. I feel like I'm losing myself, my individuality. And what's worse, I'm no longer sure if I even want to stay in this relationship if this is how things will be. Reddit. Users' comments. Blue collar realist. You have every right to feel exhausted. This sounds like a serious issue, and the fact that she doesn't see it could only make things worse. Maybe you both need some kind of mediator to work this out. Just one of those guys. Bro, I work in construction too, and I totally get you. After a shift with heavy lifting and concrete, all you want is to crash in bed. Maybe she doesn't realize just how draining it is for you. Silent Storm 22. This is a serious red flag in your relationship. She thinks this is normal, but for you, it clearly isn't anymore. Have you tried suggesting counseling? Unseen. Empathy. This sounds like an emotional deadlock. She's not hearing you, and you can't take it anymore. As hard as it may be, you both need to find a way to restore balance in your relationship. Reddit post about the title, "My wife is obsessed with sex. I can't take it anymore." Part 3. This is the third part of my story. For those who missed the previous parts, my wife Emily has become obsessed with sex, and it's destroying our relationship. I'm exhausted both physically and emotionally. She doesn't see the problem, but I can't take it anymore. Here's what I did next. A month ago, on June 7th, 2024, I decided to talk to my best friend, Tony. We've known each other for over 10 years, and he knows me better than anyone. We met at our favorite bar on Cortelyou Road around 8 p.m. I immediately poured myself a beer and began unloading everything I'd been bottling up. At first, Tony just laughed. "Man, if my wife wanted intimacy every day, I wouldn't be complaining," he said. "I get that from the outside. It may sound strange. For many men, this would be a dream. But for me, it has become a nightmare." After a few minutes of joking, he finally calmed down and listened more attentively. I explained how it was happening, how I come home exhausted after work, how Emily doesn't understand that I just don't have the energy anymore, and most importantly, how it's affecting our relationship. Tony sighed and said seriously, "You need professional help. I'm not joking. It's not just your exhaustion. This is about her too. Something's going on with Emily, and you need to figure out what it is." Even though his words weren't exactly new to me, it was the first time I seriously considered it. maybe Tony was right, and I needed to talk to someone who could help both of us. The next day, I decided to speak with our mutual friend, Sophia. She's always been wise and calm, so I thought she might offer good advice. We met at a cafe where her sister works in Williamsburg around 10:30 a.m. on Saturday. I started by telling her how Emily had changed recently. Sophia listened carefully and then said, "Mark, I'm not a psychologist, but from my experience, this looks like an internal crisis. Emily might be going through something you don't know about. Maybe she's struggling to talk about it, so she's turning to intimacy as a way to cope." It was like a cold shower. I had never thought about it that way. Maybe Emily was indeed dealing with some internal issue, and her obsession with sex was just a symptom. Sophia advised me to try talking to Emily again, but this time to suggest going to a therapist together. She emphasized that it could help both of us understand what's really going on. It took a few days for me to gather the courage to suggest this to Emily. It was Friday evening, June 14th. We were sitting in the kitchen after dinner, and I finally said it. I told her that I thought we both needed professional help, that we should go see a couples therapist. But her reaction disappointed me. She looked at me as if I'd said something ridiculous and replied, "I'm not sick, Mark. It's just that you don't want to have sex, that's all." After that, I realized the situation was far more serious than I had thought. She not only doesn't understand my feelings, but she refuses to acknowledge that something is wrong. And now, I have no idea what to do next. Reddit. Users' comments. Open Mind Society. Sounds like you're on the right path, Mark. Suggesting therapy is a good step, even if she's not ready to accept it yet. The key is not to give up. Jaded Reality 93. I understand how hard it is when your partner refuses to acknowledge a problem. But Sophia's right. It could be something deeper. Emily might be going through a crisis she hasn't even recognized yet. Urban Wanderer. Tony's right. You need professional help. If Emily's not ready, go on your own. Maybe when she sees how seriously you're taking this, she'll start thinking about it too. Daily Struggle. 78. I've been in a similar situation. Sometimes we think intimacy fixes everything, but that's just the surface. Try not just to suggest counseling, but show her that you genuinely want to help. It might change her perspective. Reddit. Post title, "My wife is obsessed with sex. I can't take it anymore, part 4. We've reached the hardest part of my story. Emily still refuses to acknowledge that we have a problem. Everything has only gotten worse, and I've realized that I need to do something before I completely lose myself." It was June 23rd, 2024, after yet another argument with Emily. I tried once more to bring up the topic of seeing a therapist, but she refused. She said it was just my problem, and I was making things more difficult than they needed to be. Her words hurt, especially when she looked at me with that inexplicable indifference. She said I was overcomplicating everything and that it was normal to want intimacy. But for me, it wasn't normal anymore. The problem wasn't just about sex. It was about the fact that I no longer saw partnership in our relationship. Things at home got worse, but work wasn't going any better either. My boss, Mr. Gray, noticed that I was becoming more distracted and slow. On July 5th, he called me in for a serious talk in his office. It was a Friday morning around 10 a.m. when he brought up my performance. He said straight out, "Mark, I see that you're not the same as you used to be. If you don't recover, I'm going to have to find someone else for your position." Those words echoed painfully in my head. I had always been one of the best workers at our construction company, but the last few months had completely drained me. That same day, after the talk with Gray, I finally made the decision to schedule a consultation with a therapist. I realized I could no longer tolerate this constant pressure, both at home and at work. On Wednesday, July 10th, I went to my first session with Dr. Allison. We met at her office in Park Slope, Brooklyn at 4:30 p.m. I was nervous and didn't know where to start. But after a few minutes of talking, I felt the weight begin to lift. I told her everything about how Emily no longer saw me as a person, but just as an object for satisfaction, about how I was losing myself, about the stress at work that only amplified my emotional exhaustion. Dr. Allison listened carefully and said, "You've come a long way, Mark. Your exhaustion isn't just physical from work. You're emotionally drained because you don't feel supported in your relationship. This can break any man." Her words felt like a revelation. I finally understood that it wasn't just a matter of physical needs or even a conflict between me and Emily. It was about the fact that I no longer felt part of something real, something valuable. That night, everything exploded. I came home and we started arguing again. She accused me of becoming cold and distant, and I replied that I couldn't live like this anymore. Word by word, the tension grew, and eventually, I just couldn't take it. I felt that if I stayed in that apartment for even one more minute, I would completely lose myself. It was July 10th, 11:47 p.m. I grabbed my keys, my jacket, and just left. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know if I'd come back at all. I just walked through the streets of Brooklyn, trying to gather my thoughts. That's when I realized, I can't take this anymore. Something has to change, or this relationship will completely destroy me. Reddit. Users' comments. Brickby Brickworker. You did the right thing by seeing a therapist. That's a huge step, and now you need to decide how to move forward. If Emily isn't willing to change, maybe it's time to focus on yourself. Thesky Willfall. 89. I was in a similar situation a few years ago. My wife didn't see the problem either until I left. It was the hardest moment of my life, but it helped both of us realize we needed help. It's a bitter truth. Bro, I feel your pain. Sometimes the biggest mistake is staying where you're no longer valued as a person. You deserve better. Therapy saved me. Dr. Allison is right. You're emotionally exhausted, and that's not something you can just ignore. If your wife isn't willing to admit there's a problem, you'll have to make some tough decisions to save yourself. Reddit post. Title: My wife is obsessed with sex. I can't take it anymore, part 5. This is the final part of my story. After I left the house that night, I found myself on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Here's what happened next. After leaving the apartment and on July 10th at 11:47 p.m., I just walked through the streets of Brooklyn, not knowing where I was going. About an hour later, I found myself in front of Tony's place on Flatbush Avenue. He immediately knew something was wrong and didn't ask too many questions. We sat on his couch, and I told him about our latest argument. I felt like I was on the edge of a breakdown. I simply couldn't carry this burden any longer.